A broken taillight rarely announces the collapse of a man's entire career. Sometimes the downfall begins with a single flick of a flashlight against a rearview mirror. On a warm October evening in Ridgemont Falls, a small town wedged between two counties in rural Tennessee, a decorated sergeant decided that a quiet young man driving an old pickup truck looked like trouble. He had absolutely no idea that the driver he was about to drag out of that truck was the only son of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Ridgemont Falls was the kind of town that had learned to live in the shadow of its own decline. Boarded storefronts lined Route 9, their windows papered over with faded auction notices. A single gas station anchored the town's northern edge, its pumps rusted at the base, its convenience store lit by a flickering sign that read Falls Fuel and Grocery. Population signs on either end of town still claimed 6,200 residents, though nobody had bothered to update the number since the textile plant closed 11 years earlier. What Ridgemont Falls lacked in commerce, it made up for in one commodity that never seemed to run dry: the authority of Sergeant Curtis Boyd. Boyd had patrolled these roads for 19 years. Broad-shouldered, sunburned at the neck, he wore his uniform a size too tight across the chest, as if daring the fabric to argue with him. Deputies rotated in and out of the department every few years, worn down by the isolation or the politics, but Boyd remained a fixture, immovable as the water tower that loomed over Main Street. He knew every family in the county by name, every business owner who owed him a favor, and every back road where a man could pull someone over without a dash camera catching more than static. Nobody questioned him. Nobody dared to point. Two sheriffs had come and gone during Boyd's tenure, both content to let him run patrol operations however he saw fit in exchange for the reliably favorable arrest numbers he produced each quarter. Complaints filed against him rarely survived the trip from the front counter to an actual case file. Ridgemont Falls had no local newspaper left to ask hard questions, no city council with the appetite to challenge a man who had personally arrested half the town's teenagers at one point or another for offenses no larger than a rolled stop sign. Fear, Boyd had learned long ago, was cheaper to maintain than respect, and considerably easier to enforce. It was a Thursday, 20 minutes past 8, when a dented gray pickup rolled past Falls Fuel with a taillight dimmer than it should have been. Boyd noticed it from the gas station lot, where he had been leaning against his cruiser finishing a coffee. He didn't need a working taillight to make a stop. He needed a reason, and a reason was the easiest thing in the world to manufacture in a town where nobody asked questions. Elijah Marsh gripped the wheel with both hands as the cruiser's lights bloomed red and blue in his mirrors. He was 27, lean, dressed in a plain gray hoodie and jeans that had seen better winters. Nothing about the truck or his clothing suggested wealth, and that was entirely intentional. Elijah had spent the last 3 days driving through rural counties scouting land for a solar manufacturing plant his father's company was quietly considering, and he preferred doing it without an entourage, without a title, without anyone treating him differently because of his last name. He had learned early that people behaved very differently around a Marsh than they did around a stranger in a pickup truck, and he wanted the honest version of every town he visited. Gravel crunched under Boyd's boots as he approached the driver's side window, flashlight raised even though the sun had barely finished setting. "License and registration," he said, his voice already carrying the practiced boredom of a man who expected obedience before he finished the sentence. Elijah reached slowly for the glove compartment, narrating his movements the way his father's security detail had trained him to since he was 16. "I'm reaching for my registration now," he said calmly. Boyd's flashlight swept across the interior, lingering on a stainless watch glinting beneath Elijah's sleeve, a watch that cost more than every vehicle parked outside Falls Fuel combined. "Nice watch for a truck like this," Boyd said, his tone shifting from bored to suspicious in the space of 4 words. Elijah didn't answer. He handed over his license, a rental agreement, and waited. Something about the silence unsettled Boyd more than any protest could have. Men who talked back, Boyd could handle. Men who said nothing at all made the hair on his neck stand up, because silence in his experience usually meant a person had something to hide, or worse, a person who wasn't afraid of him. "Step out of the vehicle," Boyd said, tapping the door twice with his flashlight. Elijah asked, evenly, what the basis for that request was. "A dim taillight," Boyd said, but his eyes never left the watch. "That's a K-value violation and I got reason to believe there's more going on here than a busted bulb." Elijah remained seated, his hands visible on the wheel. "Under Tennessee law," he said, his voice unhurried, an officer needs reasonable suspicion of a separate crime to extend a traffic stop into a search or an order to exit. A defective taillight alone doesn't establish that. Boyd's jaw tightened. 20 years of unquestioned authority had never once been interrupted by a citation of statute from the person he was pulling over. "Boy," he said, dropping the pretense of procedure entirely, "I don't care what law school taught you on your phone. Get out of the truck before I get you out myself." Elijah studied the man's face for a long moment, cataloging the same pattern he had watched play out a dozen times in his father's boardrooms and 100 times on the news. "A man mistaking a badge for infallibility. Where are you actually headed tonight?" Boyd asked, circling toward a different angle of attack now that the statute citation had failed to rattle him. "Scouting some land near the county line," Elijah answered honestly, though he offered nothing further. "Scouting land," Boyd repeated, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation. "In a truck like this? With a watch like that? You want to explain that math to me, or should I explain it to you?" Elijah kept his hands visible on the wheel, his voice never rising above a calm, even register. "I don't owe you an explanation of my finances, Sergeant. I owe you a license and registration, and you already have both. That kind of mouth is exactly why boys like you end up in situations like this," Boyd said, tapping the flashlight against his own palm. "Around here we settle for a little humility before things get complicated." Elijah met his stare without blinking, his expression unreadable, his patience the product of years spent in rooms far more hostile than a two-lane road outside a gas station. "I'd rather you settle for following the law," he replied quietly, "than for whatever it is you think humility is supposed to look like tonight." He complied. Slowly, he opened the door, keeping his hands raised at shoulder height, palms open. Behind Boyd, a second cruiser pulled in, and a younger officer stepped out, her name tag reading Delgado. She hovered near the trunk of her vehicle, watching the scene with the particular unease of someone new enough to still recognize when something was wrong. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "do we have cause for a search?" Boyd didn't turn around. "Stay on the radio, Delgado," he snapped. "This isn't your stop, Reeves." No, this was Boyd's show, and he ran it the way he ran every stop in Ridgemont Falls, as an audition for obedience. He patted Elijah down roughly, pulling a slim wallet from his back pocket and a phone from the front. Instead of opening either, he held them at arm's length like evidence bags, turning them over once before tossing them onto the hood of his cruiser. To open that wallet, to actually look, would have meant acknowledging Elijah as something other than a threat, and Boyd wasn't ready to do that yet. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Boyd ordered. Elijah did not resist. He rotated slowly, presenting his wrists, and felt the cold bite of steel cuffs ratcheted one notch tighter than necessary, a small cruelty Boyd had perfected over 2 decades of unchecked power. "You're under arrest," Boyd said. "Under arrest for what?" Elijah asked quietly, his tone still level despite the pain lancing up his forearms. "Obstruction," Boyd said. "Failure to comply. I'll figure out the paperwork once you're processed." The drive to the county station took 11 minutes, though it felt considerably longer through the wire mesh separating the back seat from the front. Elijah watched Ridgemont Falls slide past the window. A boarded pharmacy, a church with peeling paint, a diner whose neon sign had lost half its letters. It was the kind of town that corruption thrived in precisely because nobody had the resources left to fight back. He thought about the people who lived here permanently, the ones without a security detail 30 minutes behind schedule and a father who owned 3 law firms on retainer. If Boyd was willing to do this to a stranger passing through, what had he done to the residents who couldn't call anyone at all? At the station, a squat cinderblock building on the edge of town, Boyd marched him through a heavy steel door into a booking room lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. A dispatcher named Denise looked up from a paperback novel long enough to ask "Who's this?" before Boyd answered for him, "John Doe, mouthy tourist." "Sit down," he told Elijah, shoving him toward a metal bench bolted to the concrete floor. Elijah sat. His shoulders ached from the awkward angle of his cuffed arms, but his expression betrayed nothing. Delgado entered a moment later, her radio crackling against her hip, and hovered near the counter where Boyd had dropped Elijah's wallet and phone without opening either. For a second it looked as though Boyd might finally check the identification. His fingers actually brushed the leather, but a call came through on Denise's console before he got the chance. "A 2-vehicle accident on Route 9, chemical spill, all units needed." Boyd swore under his breath, slammed the wallet back onto the counter unopened, and barked an order at Denise to lock the prisoner's belongings in a box and let him sit and sweat for a few hours. He turned to Elijah one final time. "You're gonna learn some respect today," he said, before storming out with the accident call trailing behind him. The room fell quiet except for the hum of the lights and the static murmur of Denise's radio. Delgado remained behind, uncertain what to do with herself, glancing between the prisoner and the wallet sitting untouched on the counter. "Deputy," Elijah said, breaking the silence, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made Delgado flinch. "I've been detained for over 30 minutes without being processed or charged. By law, I'm entitled to a phone call." Delgado hesitated, torn between the policy she had memorized in training and the sergeant she answered to every shift. "Boyd said to let you sit," she said finally, looking away. Elijah studied her for a moment, reading the conflict on her face the way he read boardrooms for a living. "You're the ranking officer in this room right now," he said. Sergeant Boyd left the building. "That makes this decision yours, and right now you're standing at a fork in the road. You can follow a man who just broke 6 departmental policies off a cliff, or you can remember the oath you swore and let me make my call." There was no anger in his voice, no desperation. There was only certainty, the kind that unsettled Delgado more than shouting ever could have. She crossed to the counter, picked up the heavy black desk phone, and carried it to the bench. "One call," she whispered. "Make it quick." Because his hands remained cuffed behind his back, Elijah couldn't dial himself. He asked her to dial for him and recited a number from memory, a private line that only a handful of people in the world possessed. The line rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "Marsh Residence, secure line, state your business." Elijah leaned toward the receiver. "This is Elijah," he said. "I need you to reach my father immediately. Tell him I'm in the Ridgemont Falls County Jail, unlawfully detained, and my security detail has no idea where I am. 200 miles away, in a glass tower overlooking the Nashville skyline." Thomas Marsh was reviewing quarterly earnings when his assistant burst through the door without knocking, a breach of protocol so rare it stopped him mid-sentence. "Sir, it's Elijah," she said, her voice unsteady. "He's been arrested in a town called Ridgemont Falls." Thomas Marsh set down his pen with the deliberate calm of a man who had spent 30 years learning never to let his face betray his instincts. "Get me Patricia Vance," he said. "And get me the head of his security detail on the line in the next 60 seconds. I don't care what either of them is doing." Patricia Vance, chief counsel for Marsh Holdings and the person Thomas Marsh trusted with exactly 3 phone numbers in the world, answered before the first ring finished. Thomas explained the situation in 4 clipped sentences. Patricia didn't waste time on shock. "I'm calling the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the county district attorney directly," she said. "If a sergeant put hands on your son without cause, I want it documented before he has a chance to invent a story." Patricia's second call went to a former colleague who now sat as an assistant director inside the TBI's Civil Rights Division, a relationship she had cultivated for exactly this kind of emergency, though she had never once expected to actually use it. Within 4 minutes she had a case number. Within 11, she had a commitment that a response team would be wheels up toward Ridgemont Falls before Thomas Marsh finished pacing the length of his own office twice. "This is not a favor," she reminded the assistant director firmly. "This is a documented unlawful detention of a private citizen, and I expect it treated with the same urgency you'd give any other credible complaint." Meanwhile, 30 minutes behind schedule after a delayed flight, the head of Elijah's security detail, a former Army Ranger named Marcus Reyes, was pacing a rental car lot when the call came through. His blood went cold. He had one job, and for the first time in 6 years, he had failed at it. Reyes didn't wait for further instruction. He threw himself behind the wheel, radioed the 2 agents traveling with him, and pulled out of the lot with tires screaming against the pavement. "Command, this is detail lead," he said into his radio. "I need eyes on the package's last known location right now." Dispatch back in Nashville confirmed within seconds. The package's phone was pinging from the Ridgemont Falls County Sheriff's Department, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had just been notified of a possible unlawful detention at that exact address. Reyes didn't need to hear anything else. He floored the accelerator toward Ridgemont Falls, 41 minutes out. 41 minutes felt like an eternity to a man whose entire professional identity rested on never letting exactly this kind of gap happen. Reyes ran through the timeline in his head as the highway blurred past, the tire sensor failure, the decision to let Elijah wait alone at a diner 3 counties back, the slow bleed of minutes that had somehow stretched into hours. He had run protective details for foreign dignitaries, for tech executives facing credible threats, for people whose lives depended on him anticipating danger before it arrived. Tonight, danger had worn a badge, and it had walked right past every instinct he thought he trusted. Back in the booking room, Delgado had just returned the phone to its cradle when the heavy Sallyport door groaned open and Sergeant Boyd stormed back in, dusting road grime off his uniform. The accident scene had been minor, cleared faster than expected, and he was eager to finish what he'd started before his shift ended. Well, he said, walking toward the bench where Elijah still sat. Look who's still here, thinking about his attitude. Elijah met his eyes without flinching. I've thought about very little else, Sergeant. Boyd chuckled, a sound with no warmth in it, and moved behind the counter to retrieve the wallet he had never bothered to open. Let's see what we're actually dealing with here, he muttered, turning the leather over once in his hand. Sheriff, wait, Delgado blurted, unable to hold her tongue any longer. Just open it. Look at the ID. Boyd shot her a venomous glare. I told you to stay out of this, Delgado, he snapped. I'll look at his identification when I'm good and ready to process him, and not 1 second before that he slammed the wallet back onto the counter, unopened for the second time that night, and turned his full attention to Elijah, invading his personal space until his breath, thick with stale coffee, hovered inches from Elijah's face. Out here, he growled, we don't care about whatever rights you think you memorized off the internet. Respect gets earned through fear in this county, and you don't seem to fear me one bit. So I'm gonna take you back to cell block C, where the cameras happen to be broken, and we're gonna have ourselves a real conversation about manners. Reaching down, he grabbed a fistful of Elijah's hoodie and yanked him upward off the bench. Sergeant, stop, Delgado shouted, finally drawing her taser and pointing it, trembling, at her own superior officer. Let him go right now. You don't understand what you're doing. Boyd froze, staring at his deputy in genuine disbelief, his grip on Elijah's collar slackening just slightly. Have you lost your mind, Delgado, he bellowed, dropping Elijah back onto the bench and rounding on her instead. But before he could take a single step toward his own deputy, the building began to tremble. It started as a low vibration beneath the floor tiles, subtle enough that Denise glanced up from her console in confusion. Within seconds the tremor sharpened into a deep, unmistakable rhythm, rotor blades, low and fast, skimming the roof of the concrete jail. What in the hell is that? Boyd shouted, drawing his sidearm out of pure reflex. Denise's dispatch radio exploded with chatter before anyone could answer him. Unit 2, Main Street, we've got unmarked black SUVs, 6 of them, blowing through the intersection headed straight for the station. Before she could finish relaying the transmission, a thunderous impact rocked the Sallyport, metal shrieking as an armored vehicle rammed clean through the reinforced garage door. The heavy steel door leading into the booking room was kicked open with such force it slammed against the wall. Federal agents, TBI, nobody move, drop your weapon, a voice roared. A dozen tactical officers flooded into the cramped booking room, black Kevlar and raised carbines filling every inch of open space, red and green laser sights crisscrossing the room until they converged on Sergeant Curtis Boyd's chest. Marcus Reyes pushed through the wall of agents behind them, sidearm drawn, his eyes locking instantly onto the cuffed young man seated on the metal bench. Sir, Reyes said, dropping to one knee, are you hurt? I'm fine, Elijah said, his heartbeat steady despite the chaos detonating around him. Boyd stood frozen, his weapon still gripped in a trembling hand, his brain struggling to process the sudden collapse of everything he understood about his own authority. Drop it, Reyes shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Drop the weapon now. Self-preservation finally overrode 2 decades of unchecked arrogance, and the pistol slipped from Boyd's fingers, clattering against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. 2 agents closed the distance instantly, slamming Boyd face first against the dispatch partition and wrenching his arms behind his back. Denise shrieked and scrambled out of her chair, flattening herself against the far wall of her booth. While the tactical team secured the sergeant, an agent from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation crouched beside Elijah and produced a master key, releasing the cuffs that had bitten red grooves into his wrists over the last 2 hours. Reyes helped him stand, and Elijah rolled his shoulders, working the stiffness loose, already scanning the room with the composed authority of someone who had spent his entire life around men twice as dangerous as Boyd. the lead TBI agent, a woman named Special Agent Renata Cole, approached with a tablet already open. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "we've secured the building and we're pulling every case file this department has processed in the last 5 years. Your father's counsel is on the line requesting an update the moment you're able to speak." At the mention of the name Marsh, Boyd's knees buckled so severely that only the 2 agents flanking him kept him upright. His mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. I didn't know," he finally stammered, his voice reduced to something high and thin. "I thought you were just some drifter." "You thought I was a nobody," Elijah said, stepping closer, his voice quiet but carrying the full weight of everything the last 2 hours had cost him. "You thought a truck without a logo and a face without a title made me an acceptable target for your cruelty. That's the part that should terrify you, Sergeant. Not what you did to me tonight, but what you've clearly done to people in this town who never had a security detail 30 minutes behind schedule and a father who could summon a bureau raid before sunrise." Delgado stood near the doorway, still shaking from the adrenaline, watching her sergeant's entire world collapse in real time. Elijah turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since the traffic stop. "You made the phone call happen when it mattered," he said. "You drew your weapon on your own superior to protect a stranger. That took more courage than most officers show in an entire career, and Agent Cole is going to need someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried in this department. I suggest you tell her everything." Tears of relief cut through the fear still etched across Delgado's face as she nodded. "I will," she said. "I promise." Agent Cole guided her toward a quieter corner of the room to begin the first of what would become dozens of hours of testimony. Forensic technicians were already moving through Boyd's private office, carrying out boxes of files that would later reveal a pattern stretching back over a decade, falsified reports, seized property that never made it into evidence lockers, and a folder of complaints from Ridgemont Falls residents that had been buried instead of investigated. Over the following weeks, that folder would grow into a formal indictment. Prosecutors uncovered 11 separate incidents in which Boyd had detained residents without cause, 3 cases of property seized under civil forfeiture statutes and never returned, and a pattern of selectively enforcing minor traffic codes against drivers he deemed suspicious based on nothing more than the vehicle they drove or the color of their skin. A grand jury would eventually indict him on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and official misconduct. The sheriff who had spent 2 decades looking the other way resigned within the month, replaced by an interim appointee tasked with rebuilding a department that had lost the trust of an entire town. Delgado, true to her word, cooperated fully with investigators, and her testimony became the backbone of the case against her former sergeant. She stayed on with the department through the transition, one of the few officers residents said they still trusted to knock on their door. Reyes escorted Elijah out through the shattered sallyport into the cool night air, where a small crowd had begun gathering behind the crime scene tape strung across Main Street. Word of the raid had spread through Ridgemont Falls faster than any siren could travel, and residents had poured out of their homes in robes and work boots to see for themselves. Nobody wanted to miss this. As agents walked Sergeant Boyd toward a transport vehicle, his uniform rumpled and his head hanging low, a profound silence settled over the crowd, the kind reserved for moments too large to process immediately. Then, somewhere near the back of the gathering, a single person began to clap. It was tentative at first, almost apologetic, but within seconds it spread outward in a wave, dozens of hands joining, then what felt like the entire town. An elderly woman near the tape wiped tears from her cheeks and offered Elijah a small, grateful nod as he passed. He nodded back, understanding in that instant that this moment belonged to Ridgemont Falls far more than it belonged to him. Boyd had spent 19 years teaching an entire community to be afraid of him, and in the space of one October evening, that fear had finally run out. A young man near the front of the crowd, no older than 19, called out that Boyd had arrested his cousin 2 years earlier over nothing more than a busted headlight, and that his cousin still hadn't gotten his impounded car back. A woman beside him added that Boyd had once threatened to have her business shut down after she refused to comp his lunch. The stories kept surfacing, one after another, each one a small piece of the larger pattern investigators would spend the next several months documenting. For years, these residents had swallowed their grievances because they had nowhere to take them. Tonight, for the first time, someone was finally listening. The transport van doors closed on Sergeant Curtis Boyd with a heavy, final thud. Reyes opened the rear door of a black SUV that had arrived alongside the tactical convoy, and Elijah slid into the cool leather interior, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. As the motorcade pulled away from the wreckage of the Sallyport, leaving a cheering, disbelieving town behind, he pulled out a spare phone Reyes handed him and opened a message to Patricia Vance. Subject line: Ridgemont Falls, full department audit requested. He typed a single line beneath it. Nobody in this town should ever have to hope the right stranger gets pulled over. 3 hours later, a private helicopter touched down in a cordon field just outside the county line, and Thomas Marsh crossed the grass at a pace that betrayed every ounce of composure he had maintained on the phone with Patricia Vance. He found his son standing beside the SUV, upright, steady, the same man who had left for this trip 4 days earlier despite the raw marks still visible on his wrists. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Thomas simply pulled his son into an embrace, the kind that belonged to a father rather than a billionaire, and held on longer than either of them was used to in public. That I'm all right, Elijah said quietly against his father's shoulder. I need you to be more than all right, Thomas replied, his voice rough. I need you to tell me you're not going to keep doing this, driving alone into towns like this without telling anyone where you are. Elijah pulled back and looked at him steadily. If I stop going, he said, nothing in towns like Ridgemont Falls ever changes, because the only people who see it happen are the ones who can't do anything about it. I'd rather be the person who can. Thomas studied his son for a long moment, recognizing an argument he had made himself 30 years earlier, back when he was the one with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Sometimes the system in a place like Ridgemont Falls had been broken for so long that people stopped expecting it to work at all. Sometimes a badge became a shield for cruelty instead of a promise of protection. But on this particular October night, justice hadn't arrived because of who Elijah Marsh's father was. It arrived because a rookie deputy chose her oath over her comfort, because a phone call reached the right desk at the right hour, and because one quiet young man refused to let 2 hours in a small-town jail cell change who he was. Thank you for watching this story of quiet strength standing up against corrupt authority. If Sergeant Boyd's downfall kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that nobody is above the law, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss the next reveal. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Elijah's position?